Hey guys, Steph here. So let's talk about interviewing for a tech job, a developer job. I just hired somebody recently, so I figured it might be a good video since it's fresh in my mind. So what do I look for when I'm looking for developers? Number one, I'm looking for somebody who answers calls, somebody who responds to emails in a reasonable time frame, somebody who shows up to meetings on time. So if you're going in for your first interview, whether it be for a full-time position or maybe you want to pick up a contract, be on time. Be on time to the meetings. I know this seems kind of silly to mention it, but trust me, this is something a lot of nerds ignore. If you have a meeting for 9 in the morning, be sure that you're there 5 before 9. In fact, what I would suggest to do is that you figure it's going to take you half an hour to get to your meeting. Give yourself an hour. If you show up a half hour early, sit in the car, have a coffee, take a break, whatever. Don't show up a half hour early because that's kind of rude because people plan out their days. Show up 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before max, but don't be late. This is huge because they're going to judge you partly based on whether or not you show up in time. A good friend of mine is a movie scout, not a movie scout, but rather a location manager. And he says he's one of the biggest in our city. And he says a big part of his success is that he just answers calls and shows up on time. So that's your first tip. Second tip, you should research the company you are going in to interview with before you go in there. Try to figure out what they're doing, what their history is, what kind of technology they're working with, so you can bone up before you go into the meeting on what they're doing. So let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's say if they are a PHP house and they work with the Laravel framework, as an example. First of all, you should have skills in that area. Never lie about what you can do. I'm assuming that you know Laravel, but be sure you're up to date in terms of the Laravel community. You know what people are looking at, what Laravel is, what's hot in Laravel that day, what are the popular aspects of the framework, what are popular plugins, if you will. I'm using generic terms just in case somebody doesn't know Laravel. Point is, be sure when you go into the meeting, you know about the company, you know what they're working on, you know what technologies they work with, and be sure that you're up to date at least with the latest news in terms of those technologies. And of course, don't go for a job and lie about what you know or you don't know. When you do go into a job, or to interview for the job, expect to be asked questions that are relevant to their particular work. So that goes back to my second tip where I said you got to get ready. You got to understand what they're working on. So expect them to ask you questions about what you know, what you've done, and so forth. At the same time, you should be aware of the technology stack that they're working with so you can put questions to them. So you can say, for instance, let's say you were doing Python. I'm working on a Python course now, so it's at the top of my head. You should say, well, what do you use Python 2 or do you use Python 3? That kind of question. So you can ask those sorts of things. Or if you're developing games, are you using Pygame or using whatever else, TK Inter? I never know how to pronounce that properly. But anyway, you get the idea. Be aware of what they're doing, the environment they're working with. What I mean by environment, I mean the technology they work with, and be prepared to answer and ask questions. This will show an interest. This will instill a confidence in you if you're curious about all these sorts of things. The final tip is to prepare your resume so that it makes sense for them. So if the job, again, to use the same example, is a Laravel job, there's no point in you putting in that you know how to use Dreamweaver CS4 or Illustrator or Photoshop or something. You should emphasize in your resume whatever skill sets that they are looking for. And this is assuming, of course, these are the things that you want to work on as well. I had a friend of mine, for instance, was somebody who had a lot of experience with assembler. And there's a huge demand for assembler coders, but he hated writing assembler code. So he just took it right out of his resume. They don't want people to see it because he would get offers and people will constantly want to hire him to do assembler coding. Now, I'm not dissing assembler. It's just a type of coding that he didn't like to do, so I'm sure assembler people are going nuts now. But the point is to be sure to structure your resume for what you want to do and, of course, for what your prospective client or employer wants to see. So emphasize the skill sets that you know and that they want, and don't BS them. Make sure if you say you've done Laravel for 3 years, be sure that you've done it for 3 years. Or you say you know Laravel well, you've done it, fine. Now, doesn't mean just say Laravel, where I said to you before, don't put in skill sets that are not, relevant. Photoshop and Dreamweaver is not relevant in that area, in this context rather, or in this example. But saying that you know these other PHP frameworks, Zend or CodeIgniter or whatever, that is relevant because it shows that at least you know these other frameworks. So there you go. Those are my tips in terms of how you should approach presenting yourself for a new job. Always go in there, be on time, speak well. Don't be a jerk. Don't be rude. Don't be arrogant, and be curious about what they're doing, and be sure that you bone up beforehand, meaning you're up to date with regards to the technologies that they are using, so that you can answer questions more easily and ask questions of them as well. So there you go. If you do that, your chances of getting work are far higher. That's for sure. All right, ciao.